Happy Halloween, nerds, and welcome to the 6th annual Swholloween! So seeing as last year I basically specifically had a literal meltdown, I died, and was resurrected promptly afterwards, I was so drained that I decided, let's do something completely different. This year, we're going to talk about a good movie. Good horror is so far and few between these days. It's so rare that you find one that isn't just a gratuitous misuse of a jump scare or a cheap trend chaser that just is trying to steal your money. But tonight, I've got something planned that will hopefully change Swholloween forever. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a good horror movie. Tonight, we're going to be reviewing Trick-or-treaters are here.
Trick-or-treat!
Here's your candy, kids.
What are you supposed to be?
Well, I didn't really have a lot of time to prepare. I'm kind of trying to watch a movie for Halloween.
What movie?
Altered States.
What's that?
Well, Altered States is the best horror movie you've probably never seen. Trippy visuals, cerebral plot, and a genuinely terrifying atmosphere, Altered States is one of those movies that sort of falls to the wayside in the pop culture consciousness, but by God does it deserve a bigger following than what it gets. This movie opens with Dr. Eddie Jessup, played by William Hurt in his first ever big screen film role, experimenting with sensory deprivation techniques to try and explore his theory that the way we perceive reality and our conscious and unconscious states are all tangible things that the mind actually visits. After regular deprivation techniques just don't get the results he's looking for, he takes a trip to Mexico, where he visits an indigenous tribe who use hallucinogenic mushrooms to achieve a spiritual state similar to what Jessup is trying to find. Ultimately, combining the drugs with the tank, Jessup begins to really see results of what he's after. Is it all hallucinations brought on by the drugs, or is he really truly changing his form to that of a primal man through genetic memories? And if so, what does that mean of man's understanding of creation if he can actually live through it again? A modern take on the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, Altered States is a superbly crafted horror science fiction story that holds no punches with its ideas. While not a perfect movie by any stretch, Altered States is still leagues above horror movies of its contemporary, and especially the horror movies of today. Written by the original screenwriter of acclaimed film Network and directed by the guy responsible for the rock opera visuals from The Who's Tommy, Altered States is a mind-bending look into some of our deepest existential fears. Well, there you go.
Is it a scary movie?
Yeah, of course it's a scary movie.
It doesn't sound very scary.
Okay. So why did I pick Altered States, then? What actually makes it a scary movie? Well, for starters, Altered States is not a traditionally scary movie by the standards we normally put a scary movie into. Scary movies, as we typically tend to think of them, are usually supernatural in nature, diving into the unknown or the macabre to deliver the scares. Typically, scary movies are about a what-if factor that plays off of our natural fear of what we don't understand. While elements of this exist within this movie, the unknown is still more knowable than we'd probably like to see in usual horror. The thing that makes Altered States so scary is its dedication to reality. This is all science based on real theories. Sure, the actual literal and physical transformation of a man into a primordial ape is a little more far-fetched than, real science, but it's really the only stretch of the movie. Altered States is good horror because it's sci-fi horror. Instead of playing off of the past like most horror movies tend to do, things like folklore and superstition, gothic architecture, Victorian sensibilities, it instead looks to the future for its answers, or at the very least the present, making it much more accessible a scare. Where a movie like, say, Swholloween's favorite movie to allude to, The Exorcist, the horror is based on a situation we once believed in the past. The idea that spirits can inhabit a body and enact evil intent. While some of the more superstitious or religious out there might still believe this, most mainstream audiences don't really believe in ghosts or demons or anything like that anymore. It simply acts as a metaphorical representation of our fears that can then manifest itself into a narrative. Altered States instead says, no, existence itself is scary. Not knowing who or why we are is scary. Taking what is normally considered serious but banter-like philosophical musings and embracing them to the fullest extent of, holy shit, I have no idea and I am terrified because of it. It's about human existence in general. It's about how death is inevitable, life is fleeting. Everything we amount to on this miserable little planet will just eventually fade away into nothing, and we all amount to goddamn jack peeny weeny shit. If that ain't scary, I don't know what else is. So you know what the fuck the dumb trick-or-treaters know about scary movies, right? There's just a bunch of dumb kids and God. Alright, well, hang on.
Trick or treat!
Yeah, I heard you, you fucking rascals. What do you want from me?
What are you doing?
I don't know, I'm watching a movie.
What were those monkey sounds?
Because he turns into a fucking monkey? What do you want me to tell you? Okay, listen, so here's what happened. John C. Lilly, the neuroscientist whose drug-induced trips into the psyche and actual use of sensory deprivation tanks inspired the plot of this movie, is quoted in an interview while talking about altered states saying, "As for the scientist's regression into an ape-like being, the late Dr. Craig Enright, who started me on ketamine while taking a trip with me here in the isolation tank, suddenly became a chimp, jumping up and down and hollering for 25 minutes. Imagine that. Imagine being in a room, tripping balls, and the guy next to you has turned into an ape, and is just going shit-faced wild." The transformation scenes are some of the greatest bits of the movie and pay the biggest homage to the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde story. The idea that Jessup can literally regress into another version of himself, one with no sense of modern morality or societal expectations, one where his only thought is to survive, then later potentially murder somebody and running off and killing a goat in the zoo. To me, this is even more interesting than the Hyde character in the original story because while Mr. Hyde is a Brutus representation of everything a man could potentially be, Jessup's primordial ape man is a reflection of where man actually came from. Now, does that make sense? It's a classic horror.
That doesn't sound very scary.
Fuck 'em. Fuck 'em. Fuck 'em. Fuck this stupid holiday. Fuck those fucks. I hope they rot in fucking hell. Listen, Altered States is honestly probably the most cerebral movie I've done on this channel. This is actually some deep stuff. Like, it actually has something to say. And it's not just too heavy-handed either. Like, it's sure, some parts of it do get a little bit art-housey, but for the most part, the symbolism is within the interpretation of the viewer. It's telling you, the audience, hey, here's an idea, here's a metaphor. Why don't you visually interpret what we have to say? Unlike some movies where we'll just heavy-handedly tell you every single goddamn thing you need to know about it because, fuck you, here's dialogue. The symbolism in Altered States further exemplifies the point of the narrative, about man's relationship to the unknown and creation. One of the first scenes in the movie, where Jessup and his future wife have sex for the first time, ends with him still ever thinking about religious allegories, even while caught up into just day-to-day life. He has a nightmare that is full of religious symbolism, hearkening to his own studies on the schizophrenic patients that he has, where he theorizes that their relationship to God is more real than delusion. One example in the movie is we see a constant allusion to a goat. In traditional religious dogma, at least in Christian religious dogma, the goat, or the hooved creature, represents the devil. In this scene, the goat has several eyes on its face, probably an allusion to it either being an all-seeing or possibly a reference to a traditional angel depiction. The goat represents man's ethereal relationship with the unknown, with God himself. It being in the form of a dream, we imply that this is all in Jessup's head, as it's his own thoughts and understandings of the world that betray him and frighten him. The second time a goat is referenced is the first time that Jessup has a transformation into a primitive state. Not yet literally, as he doesn't leave the deprivation tank, but it's described to us in a voiceover as Jessup's friends and colleagues listen in on him describing his experiences in the experiment.
Hey, Eddie? I'm becoming one of them. I'm no longer observing. I'm one of them. I'm killing a goat. I'm eating the blood, hot flesh of a goat.
He describes seeing a goat and how now, as a primitive man, he is eating the goat, killing it simply for nourishment. Again, this is still somewhat within Jessup's imagination, as we are yet to find out that his transformations are literal. The goat, however, as a symbol for religious allegory, a symbol for man's relationship with God, is slowly becoming less and less all-powerful. Yes, it's still a visceral moment for Jessup as he describes himself in the relationship to the goat, killing it and eating it, but it's now played sort of as an understatement. The goat is now just a resource to him. It's a means to an end for Jessup in the world where he is now less evolved. Finally, the last reference to a goat is the final time that Jessup transforms into his Mr. Hyde primordial man. He escapes the hospital that they're conducting the experiments in, and he goes on a rampage through the city. Eventually, he winds up in the zoo, where finally, for himself in the real world, he gets to hunt and kill a goat, then consume it. The goat at this point is not even mentioned in the narrative context. It's precisely what it is, a primitive man eating a goat because he's hungry. No one laments the loss of the goat, and no one even mentions the goat from here on out. The goat represents that as man becomes more evolved, he creates his own narratives about the world. For us, the narrative worked backwards as Jessup became less evolved in the process, but at the same time, it's also in complete tandem to Jessup losing his need to have those metaphors and allegories in the first place. The more primitive his mind became, the more he realized that the goat is just a goat. It's there to be eaten and consumed because it has to be. There is no greater meaning, only what we, mankind, make of it. And ultimately, that's what the movie's trying to say. The movie is basically putting us into the position that Jessup is in. The more and more we become evolved, the more and more we put meaning behind the things that happen in life. But the reality of it is there is no meaning. The goat is just a goat. It's there because we need to eat it. And it doesn't mean anything. And that's absolutely frightening. I think the best thing about Altered States, frankly, is that the movie itself is ultimately trying to say something about our own existence, about death and life and religion and frankly just whatever you can think of, it probably is in there somewhere, and using that sense of horror as a kickstand to the whole idea. Like if the movie was a bicycle, the kickstand is horror as a genre. But it's not a movie that's intentionally there just to scare you. The scares themselves back up the movie as a whole. Ultimately, the best thing about a movie that you put thought into is that you can... It's those fucking kids again!
Trick or treat!
Yeah, trick or treat, trick or fucking treat, I get it, okay? What the fuck do you want?
I talked to my dad, and he said that Altered States isn't a scary movie, it's science fiction.
Now listen to me. The ultimate point of all of this, for me, is something I've basically been trying to convey since I did the first Swholloween. I don't think I quite had this opinion formulated for myself yet, but I knew it was there. It took me 6 years doing some of the worst Halloween movies I'd ever seen, becoming more and more cynical until seeing Altered States for the first time late last year, right after I had seen Insidious 4, that it really opened my eyes. Horror, as a genre, is arguably the best way to express the rawest problems of the human condition. Drama, love stories, Oscar-winning movies, all of that pales in comparison to the potentials of what horror can accomplish. If Altered States had been just a normal science fiction movie alone, if it had just been about man's inner search for self and the meaning of existence and creation, then all we would have gotten was another Star Trek the Motion Picture. Don't get me wrong, I actually like Star Trek 1, probably more than most people who like Star Trek movies do, but the point stands. Science fiction in its purest form is a futurist's vision of Western philosophy. It's dry and heady and opting to only ponder and muse for the sake of just thinking. Horror, a common collaborator with sci-fi, is what gives the meaning behind the thought. It gives the meat and the edge to the narrative. Utilizing what scares us as a way to reflect on common human experiences is exactly what makes horror great. Going back to Star Trek, some of the greatest episodes of the original series are the episodes that are basically horror setups. What's considered one of their greatest episodes, Season 1, Episode 25, The Devil in the Dark, it's literally a monster story. There's literally something hiding in the minds that is trying to kill them off. It's a slasher story of all things, and it's one of the greatest episodes in Star Trek's history. Shows like The Outer Limits and The Twilight Zone sometimes use science fiction and horror interchangeably to tell some of the greatest essays on the human existence that we know.
So, do you get it? Does it make sense to your little, stupid, fucking plebeian minds?
Well, I might have scarred a few psyches there. I probably will not be invited back to the neighborhood potluck. Altered States is a love story. Above all else, besides the fact that it's scary, that it's intense, that it's cerebral, that there's thought put into it, that besides the fact that the narrative is about something, ultimately what drives home the whole thing and the whole plot is that it's a love story. Ultimately, besides being what I'm willing to argue is one of the greatest horror movies I've seen, Altered States is, above all else, about love. It's love that saves the protagonists from their own selves. Jessup is seen in a downward spiral, one that comes to a visual reality with the spinning vortex of a portal he creates in his own lab. It's not until his wife, whom he divorced earlier, Emily, reaches out to grab him that he's saved from himself. She still loves him, and had loved him since the very beginning, but he had always been distant and more focused on his work than anything else. He was so determined to find that deeper meaning to man's first steps into thought, unlocking genetic memories, that he's completely ignored Emily and their daughters for 7 years until they ultimately divorced. However, the vortex in the lab isn't where the movie ends, despite it seeming like a very perfect place to end it. The movie ends with having gone home, thinking that the experiment was done and over, and finding that Jessup still had regression within him, and that the transformation was causing him to become even more primordial than before, becoming a non-corporeal entity. Again, Emily tries to save him, but it's too powerful. The energy washes over her and begins to consume her as well. Jessup, in his final act of self-realization, fights off the transformation through sheer will because the love of another is too powerful to ignore. His wife loves him and saved him, and he loves her despite not realizing it earlier. He shakes off that transformation and he grabs her, saving her as well. The ultimate point of this movie is that human connection is all we have. Our experiences as modern humans are what drives us. At one point, we were primordial beings, frightened and angry, only knowing one urge, the urge to survive. And after all this time, after all the science and experiments we've done, the only conclusion we have is still that, our need to survive. But as modern man, our needs are different. We no longer have to have that fear for safety. We no longer have to have that fear for our next meal. We no longer have to fear a lack of a spiritual connection. As modern man, our needs are a human connection, love, life, and happiness. We can spend our entire lives searching for answers to a problem we may never solve, but ultimately, what we needed, and the only thing we have as beings who are self-aware, is each other. Because the horror that is existence, knowing only what we can perceive with our senses, reaching out to the only other creatures next to us who also understand this phenomenon, it's all we have. Horror movies, horror stories tell us so much more about ourselves than we give them credit. When a good horror movie comes around, it makes us feel something far more relatable than any other emotion. Fear. And with that fear, we can connect and grow. Framing a horror movie around a love story, putting the really dangerous and intense things into the context of two people falling madly in love with each other, one not sure what to do with it, the other one desperately clinging on to this thing they call emotion. The fact that it's entirely about human connection, and that is what's the most frightening thing of all in the entire movie, is frankly just pure genius. Something as raw and as nerve-exposing as love, and saying, holy shit, in that there's a literal, portal to hell of some kind in my laboratory, but thank God you love me, because holy shit! Man, fuck those kids. All this talk about love, I'm gonna call my girlfriend. Hey. Yeah, have you ever seen Altered States? You've never seen it. Okay, have you ever seen the music video to a-ha's Take On Me? Okay, well take that and work backwards.